Thank you, Eric. So let's start our event officially. This is a webinar series where we are organized by our Hungarian Europe Society, sponsored by the US Embassy in Budapest. And this is an event when we want to talk about civil activism or civic activism and the shrinking space for civil activism. I would make a very short introduction before introducing our guests to the audience. First of all, shrinking space for civil activism. This is an expression we use now, and it's a very good description of the current state of the game or politics in general in Hungary and maybe in some other so-called illiberal or anti-liberal populist democracies. I'm not sure whether we can still use the word democracy at all. This shrinking space is especially true in Hungary for NGOs and active citizens, where this illiberalism, populism is the rule, and where governments have introduced new measures, changed laws, parallel with a nationwide propaganda smear campaign, like in Hungary, against foreign agents, mercenaries of George Soros, and other sort of so-called enemies of the country, of the nation. This sort of stigmatization, and which comes often with exclusion, with discrimination, is just part of a broader arsenal that the Orbán government has used in the recent years against liberal-minded civil groups and individuals, certainly the opposition, which had a chilling effect on the broader public and the electorate as well. My second point is that, well, pressure by the government always comes with resistance from the bottom. And in Hungary, and I think in many other countries, like in Poland especially, civil groups, communities, cities, regions, and individuals often have reacted with courage and have their own tools to protest and to find their ways even successfully to block the government's intentions or to express at least their indignation and to express their alternative views to the government. Also, cooperation among civil actors, like in Hungary, amongst many NGOs, which is called, this cooperation is called civilizáció in Hungarian, civilization, as well as the international solidarity which comes from abroad, actually help a lot keeping the spirit and commitment to our values at a high level. Now, my next point is that meanwhile, in traditional liberal democracies, these NGOs and grassroots organizations have very different issues to discuss and very different problems to face. They are claiming that their involvement in political processes and decision-making is not at all satisfactory and acceptable in the circumstances of the 21st century anymore. This is especially true in the case at European level, where there is an increasing pressure on EU institutions and member states to listen to the voice of citizens and to involve their representatives who want to be present at the talks, for example, of the new conference on the future of Europe, which is to be started finally on the 9th of May this year. So my next point is that civil participation is strongly connected to political, often partisan environment. This is a particularly exciting new era when civil activism, direct democracy, and representative democracy are all present in a healthy political society in traditional liberal democracies. Here, conflicts and tensions are seen as natural. And one of the key issues is to be discussed how civil groups can participate in political processes in order to find solutions to complex social and political problems. Here, NGOs are not seen as the enemies of the government. Now, my last point is that global conditions have changed a lot in recent years. First, Brexit and the victory of Donald Trump created a momentum for anti-liberal political forces. But now transatlantic relations seem to return to what we call normal. There is a new chance for political reforms and for the inclusion of civic actors and citizens worldwide, showing that there is a strong and successful alternative to populist authoritarian claims. We will discuss all these issues, I'm sure, in the next almost 1.5 hours. So let me introduce our distinguished guests, our authors, who all have had a long experience in both political and civil activism. I'm sure they can analyze these current challenges from both perspectives. So instead of a civil romanticism or a partisan political arrogance, we will listen now to balanced and sophisticated arguments. Let me introduce first of all Roger Casale. He is the executive director of New Europeans, a very much pro-EU civil group which fought against Brexit in Britain and still fighting for the rights of British citizens living in the EU, as well as EU citizens living in Britain. He was also a member of parliament in the Westminster in London. Our second speaker is Thomas Omelia, who is now the Washington director of PEN America, which organization, here I quote, stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect open expression in the United States and worldwide, and also fights for democratic representation of minority groups in the United States. He had important government positions during the Obama era and previously worked for Freedom House as well as for the National Democratic Institutes. Our third speaker is Emil Kiryas, originally from North Macedonia, well, previously from Yugoslavia, who is vice president at Liberal International, living in Barcelona, who also had a high-level government position as junior minister of foreign affairs. He is founder and managing director at Kirjas Global, which, I quote again, provides geopolitical and strategic advice to heads of states and government and political leaders in bilateral and multilateral context. So all three guests are our personal friends, the friends of our Hungarian Europe Society, and I would like to thank you all for accepting our invitation and to be here with us right now. Now, as we agreed, all our three speakers will have about 8 to 10 minutes. You don't have to insist on your written papers. You might improvise. It's up to you. I'm sure we will have a very good discussion. The floor is first of all for you, open, Roger. So please start your introduction, and then we will ask the two consultants, discussants, to go ahead with their views. So Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, István, and good evening to you, to the Hungarian Europe Society, to my dear fellow discussants, Emil and Thomas. I thank you to them for their very kind remarks about my paper and for their very stimulating responses, to you, István, for this invitation, and to our dear guests for being with us here this evening. And you said, you mentioned the word friendship, and we are friends. It's very good to see old friends and to have the chance to make new friends. I'm only sorry we can't be sitting side by side, having a coffee, reading the papers as we did, you and I, have that very nice photograph that we still have that I hope we can share on your website of the two of us as I'm sitting in Berlin just before we went to the Futurium in Berlin in January last year for the launch of the Civic Engagement Hub, and full of energy and excitement. And then of course we've had the lockdown, and the lockdown, I hope everybody is safe and well, and what a challenge that is. But of course for autocrats like I like to call him Little Victor, I've been told that I can speak completely freely about the Hungarian, what do we call him? Little dictator, and so I will. He's not our friend. The pandemic was an absolute gift, because first of all, he's going to get lots of money. And secondly, it's a great opportunity to continue to entrench his project of institutionalizing his liberal democracy. I'm sure we'll come back to that later on. And you only need to look at a country like Belarus to understand where you can end up if you collapse the civic space completely. You don't have respect for the rule of law, you don't have democracy, you don't have human rights, then you end up with women sleeping on concrete floors in prisons, and men being beaten up by boys in black balaclavas. Perhaps have a word about that as well. I should, if I may, if I've got one eye on the clock, so I'll try to be quick, just say that New Europeans is based in Brussels as well as London. I'm speaking to you from Italy. I live in Italy. We are a pan-European civil rights organization, so we're very busy at the moment, you can imagine. Yes, we were very engaged in Brexit, and I'm happy to take questions about the B word and the fight to protect citizen rights afterwards. But now we're working mainly on, as István mentioned, the Conference on the Future of Europe, and on issues to do with what we call a Europe of the citizens. We want a Europe of the citizens, of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So we're very engaged in Poland in relation to the rule of law, also in Hungary, where we work with, as I mentioned, it's Civilization, and I've just published an op-ed with Veronica Mora, who's one of the founders, and with Esther Nagy, who I think is going to be joining us shortly. So we can talk about those issues too. And this week we have had meetings about Belarus and Ukraine, and also the future of European citizenship. So we work across a wide range of issues, not just in relation to the huge car crash that was Brexit. I'm very happy to take questions about that. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I mean, I want to just, if I may, make sort of three quick points, I suppose. I mean, if you've read the paper, you understand that I talk about Europe 1, Europe 2, Europe 3. Europe 1 is the Europe of nations and states. Europe 2 is the Europe of markets and money. Europe 3 is the Europe of the citizens. I believe that now is the time for a Europe of the citizens, of cities and civil society. I think in the first phase of the development of the European Union after the Second World War, the primary actors were statesmen, de Gasperi, Schuman, we know there were Adenauer, de Gaulle. Europe was rebuilt through the vision of statesmen. In the second phase, that really came with the creation of the single market and the single currency, I would argue that the prime drivers of that were really banks and multinational corporations and the economy. It was all about creating a single market and a single currency. The challenge for us now in Europe, in what I call Europe 3, in this new phase of development, is really to create a more democratic Europe. I don't necessarily mean a federal Europe where you don't have nation states anymore. I'm fairly agnostic about that. What I mean is a more participatory democracy, the kind of thing that Emil was talking about in his paper. And I point you towards that. The idea of more direct democracy alongside representative democracy, not to replace representative democracy, but to find the two together, to give citizens a voice. And citizens have found their voice in Europe today. We saw that in the United Kingdom with Brexit. Now, Thomas quite rightly picked me up in his paper by saying, you know, don't go too easy on the fake news. And there's a fantastic paper that his organization, PEN, wrote called Truth on the Ballot, which is on Thomas's paper, and click on that link and read it. It's very, very important. And we know there's this terrible challenge about fake news. But we have to also ask ourselves, why are citizens so susceptible to fake news? Thomas talks about low information groups. Why are people so susceptible? Why are they inclined to believe the lies? And you know, the thing about a lie is it sort of lets you off the hook. After Brexit, people were able to say, oh, well, if I'd known that was a lie, I wouldn't have voted for Brexit. Yes, you would. You wanted to do it anyway. And we see this in the United States now as well. How can it be in people's interests to destroy the capital, to tear things down? It's not. We have to understand that people do the things that they want to do. And sometimes the most absurd, they are prepared to believe the most absurd things that validate them and make them feel good. And so it's not just a question of dealing with the fake news, although we have to deal with that. Of course we do. You know, the fake news helps autocrats. It undermines democracy. It collapses the civic space. If only we had a patch that we could put on to protect ourselves against the virus of fake news, in the same way that we have a mask against the virus. Donald Trump and his friends would be telling us to take the mask off and take the patch off and listen to the fake news. We need both of those things, but we need much more as well. So I think it's not either or, it's both. We need to combat fake news, and we need also to work to develop the strength of civic space and civil society. So I think that's a really important point that I want to make. Don't think that just by countering fake news that we've dealt with everything. And I think also we need to find the commonalities. I think this is my second big point. You know, of course, the situation of Hungary is very different to the situation of Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and the United States. But if you look at it through the eyes of autocrats and dictators, they use the same playbook. Steve Bannon, who advised Donald Trump, he comes over to Europe and he advises the far right and those who want to undermine the rule of law and democracy. And they use the same playbook. It's like the Romans. They like to, one of the things that they do is to divide and rule, divide and rule. How can we stop autocratic leaders playing the game of divide and rule? I think we have to learn from each other. I think we have to work together. And I think, and this is my third point, I think the transatlantic relationship is absolutely central, absolutely key to this. And so I was very pleased to hear from Thomas's paper. And Thomas, I must say, I'm very pleased to meet my alma mater, Johns Hopkins. I also studied at the Johns Hopkins. And I know that Thomas also is a very influential Irish American. I think we mustn't forget the Irish voice. I believe he's one of the top list of one of the most 100 most influential Irish people in America. I remember Joe Biden, when he was interviewed by the BBC immediately after his election, he said, BBC, I'm Irish, and I was very reassured by that. So we need the Irish Americans, the Italian Americans. I'm partly Italian, European. We need to work together. And if you think about what the historian Ferdinand Braudel called the longue durée, if you take a look at the long period of time since the Second World War, and you think about my schema of Europe 1, Europe 2, Europe 3, throughout that period, America has been absolutely central to what's happened. The transatlantic relationship has been central to what's reshaped Europe. Of course, we had the Marshall Plan after the war. We had the protection of the American military in the context of the Cold War. And that was something that helped Europe, but it also helped the United States because it gave us the freedom that allowed the trade, the ships to sail again. And then in Europe too, you know, we call it the Washington Consensus. It's a slight misnomer because actually the consensus is in Berlin just as much as it was in Washington. But nevertheless, there was a coherent set of ideas that reshaped Europe after the after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think we need that transatlantic relationship now. But I think the focus is, as well as security and the economy, now needs to be civil society. What can we learn from the Americans? What can the Americans learn from us about protecting the civic space, strengthening the civic space? Because this is not just the right thing to do for those of us who, like me, spend their time in a civil rights organization. It's a necessary thing to do to underpin the security and the resilience of the European model going forward. So I look forward to a very interesting discussion. I've got a lot more to say, but if I may, István, I'll leave it there. I think that this is our time as citizens. This is a time when we need to really all take our responsibilities seriously as citizens to protect the civil space, to get involved in our democracy at local level, at national level. We need to wake up and realize that we have the future in our hands, and it's really down to us. But we can only achieve that by working together. That means working together in our communities. It means working together across member states of the European Union. And it means working together with the Americans and reanimating the transatlantic relationship. And nobody's got all the answers as to how to do that, but that's what we should be talking about. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to come and talk, to be part of this conversation today, and look forward to what everybody's got to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Roger. Thank you. Just one question to you, because you also mentioned, and this is the issue we are all excited about, the conference on the future of Europe. And can you tell us a little bit, or can you elaborate it a little bit in a relatively short time period? What would be your suggestion? How could civil society actors or citizens be involved into this process, not to make it a usual top-bottom exercise, but just the contrary, or both, as you mentioned, that participatory democracy and representative democracy might go hand in hand. So what would be your suggestion in concrete terms, maybe, how it should work, how should it look like?
Thank you very much indeed. I'll be very brief. So the Conference on the Future of Europe, remember, this was the idea of the French President Emmanuel Macron to consult all 450 million EU citizens about the strategic priorities going forward for the European Union. A bit like we had the convention 20 years ago, where you had the Eminence Grise wanting to write a constitution that went spectacularly wrong. They thought, no, this time we'll start the conversation from the grassroots and we'll work up what it is that people want to do. Right. Then along came the pandemic, and so the whole thing has been stalled for a year, and there were also various political difficulties. But the good news is that this week, the three institutions have signed a declaration, and the conference will go ahead. It will start on the 9th of May. It'll be 1 year instead of 2. And the Commission, and they have accepted a proposal that there should be an online multilingual platform that enables consultation at every level, local, national, European. So the answer to István's question is, you'll need to wait to see what happens in Hungary in terms of what opportunity, as far as the Hungarian European Society is concerned, to consult locally and nationally in Hungary. I suspect those opportunities may be rather limited, but there will also be trans-European agoras. And I think I can see that Estonaki has now joined us from the Union of European Federalists in Hungary. Organizations such as Estes, organizations such as New Europeans, pro-European organizations that are organizing at a European level, MEPs, civil society organizations, organized civil society like the European Civic Forum, are opportunities to have your voice heard and put that into the into the mix in terms of this consultation. So I think it's an invitation to join a conversation of what you think should be important for the future of Europe. And one of the things that I hope will come out of this is that the rule of law is something that doesn't just concern Hungary and Poland, but that is absolutely key strategic priority for the whole of Europe, because we don't have the rule of law in Hungary. We don't have the rule of law in Europe. The mechanisms that are at the European Union's disposal to deal with rule of law breaches in Hungary will be the same mechanisms that the European Union and the European Court of Justice will need to use when we see breaches of rule of law, perhaps in Italy, if Salvini comes into government, or elsewhere, and it'll be the same mechanisms. So we can't make them work in Hungary. We won't be able to make them work anywhere else. We won't be able to speak a Europe which Emil told us he wants and which I want, of human rights and of democracy, a safe space for democracy. So I think it's a very important point to say, this is the kind of Europe we want. Second thing, and I'll finish with this, it's only 1 year. Let's see what comes out of it. Macron wants it to finish before the French presidential elections next year. But I think with all of these things, István, it's important to look through the event itself to the other side. what's going to be happening the other side of the Conference on the Future of Europe? What is going to be the legacy of the Conference on the Future of Europe? In my view, there should be a permanent mechanism for consulting with citizens between elections. And I think this is one of the things that we should work for. But István, I'd be very happy to come again or to work with the Hungarian Society. I'm sure Esther would be the same, and Europeans, to create a series of meetings during the conference to see what your community are saying and make sure that those voices get heard. The big challenge is going to be absolutely making sure that the voices that have more difficulty getting heard, whether because you're in a situation like Hungary, which is shutting down the civic space, or whether you're from marginalized or racialized community, perhaps somewhere in Europe, these are the voices that need to be prioritized in these conferences. These are the voices that need to be heard. And I see it as the first stage of building much more participatory democracy in Europe, not just during the conference, but very importantly, what happens after that as well. Finally, just very finally, there's something called Europe Future Fringe, which you know about, István, which we're involved in New Europeans, which is also a way outside in parallel with the conference, the official conference, to have events and activities and voices heard and so on, and we can help for that as well. So I would encourage all at this meeting tonight and all who may get a chance to see it later to take the opportunity of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and we get your voices heard, and the way to do that is by us all working together, and we are completely at your disposal to help with that.
Okay, thank you for this supplement to your presentation. And now I would switch to, because time is running out, to Thomas Melia. Please go ahead, and we are very curious about your perspectives. The floor is yours.
Thank you, István. It's great to be together with you, and I see the names of some friends, Americans and Hungarians on the screen, so I hope they'll get a chance to jump into this conversation. Actually, the comments that István and Roger have made already prompted me to revisit what I was going to say. István, when you began a little while ago, you talked about how the transatlantic relationship is returning to normal. But it's normal in a different way because we have lived through the experience of the last 4 years. And so it'll never be the same again. European governments and peoples have reacted to the antics of the Trump administration and the way that the United States has moved in erratic ways, including away from solidarity with Europe and into economic and trade wars with our closest allies. I mean, a lot of these things were previously unthinkable, and now we're going to have to live with that in the aftermath, because Europeans will say this could happen again. What's going to happen after the next presidential election? Second point is that partisanship in the United States has evolved. I mean, as a young man visiting Europe a couple decades ago, I was always struck by the British parliamentary system in which the members of the opposition party always were obliged to vote against whatever the government was proposing. In lockstep. And I just thought that was really odd, because in the United States, we had a tradition of having Democrats and Republicans come together on most major legislative proposals. It's sort of a practice in our federal Congress that the most important things get sponsored by jointly by Republicans and Democrats, whether it's on environmental policy or economic policy or foreign policy, especially. But we've lost that now in the United States over the last 10 to 15 years. And you see that, as I wrote in my paper, in the way that Republicans in the Congress in the last few days have voted 100% against the large economic and medical relief package that President Biden and congressional Democrats put forward, rejecting the opportunity to participate in shaping that legislation. The Republicans, to a person, voted no. Even though, as I wrote in the paper, most Republican officials at the state and local level support it, and even most Republican voters have said they want this package to succeed. So the National Republican Party is in a very different place than many of the Republican constituents and local officials on this question of the economic relief that's been enacted just yesterday when President Biden signed the bill. On the other hand, one thing that they all agree at the federal and the local level is that they want to manipulate the political system to exclude certain voters from our system who are consistently likely to vote for Democrats. And the most conspicuous block of voters that is described that way are Black Americans. And so, Republicans at the state and federal level have made a decision that their political prospects will be improved if they can make it difficult or impossible for Black Americans to vote. We have gone in this last several years, and it's reaching a crescendo and a crisis right now, this year, in a return to a kind of racism that I think we had thought we had moved beyond in the United States. But apparently we're back where we were Jim Crow years in the 1930s and the 1950s. I mean, it's really startling. And so we've been reminded that the racism that has troubled our country since its founding, with the institutionalization of slavery, has never gone away. It's still there. It's the most important social issue in our country today. And we have people in one party trying to come up with ways to get beyond this and resolve it. And we have people in the other party that want to like double down and say, yes, we are a white Christian minority party. We want it, and the only way we can prevail is if we can exclude immigrants, especially Black Americans, but also immigrants of color from other parts of the world. So we are in a crisis now that makes it more difficult for us to act like everything has returned to normal with the election of Joe Biden and a Democratic-led Congress. So you have to keep that in mind as you think about looking at us. And one of the ways that manifests, and in the discussions that Roger presented about trade issues and economics, you will see that the Biden administration will be different than the Obama administration and the Clinton administration in that it will focus much more robustly on the potential adverse impacts on working class Americans of international trade deals than have Biden's predecessors. So even though Biden was part and parcel of the Obama administration, he will be very wary of returning to the status quo ante in the global trade agreements that were right at the tip of consummation at the end of the Obama administration, Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership. So expect it to be different, notwithstanding the genuine commitment that Biden and Blinken and others have to engaging more cooperatively with Europeans and Asian partners. So you will see a different kind of bottom line in negotiations about trade issues. What else? I'm just going to jump around to a couple different things just to put them on the table. I was struck by Roger's discussion also about talking about the EU and your European conversation that's to launch on May 9. 15 and more years ago, the concerns about the European Union, you may recall, were about the democratic deficit and the question of whether the EU should go wider or deeper. I haven't heard that conversation now in years. It's completely gone. The crises, from the economic crises of a decade ago to the migrant crisis of 2015 to the rise of populists in Britain and Germany and other countries, seems to have put that question off to the side. I haven't heard anybody talk about expansion. There's a kind of a conversation with Ukraine and Georgia, but I don't think it's real. I don't think they're going to be able to get into the EU anytime soon. So it's interesting how the zeitgeist, the conversation about whether the EU seems to have shifted so dramatically and accentuated by the Brexit, which kind of marked the end of a kind of optimistic kind of forward momentum in EU institution building. And I think that we still don't know what the real implications of that are. Certainly Britons don't know. Let's see what else. Emil's paper talks about how important the digital world is going to be in our future. And I want to use this to put a word of caution about embracing the digitalization of our societies and our economies in the context of disinformation and fraudulent news and big lies that are dominating our politics, especially in the United States. The shift in American terms, you have to know that local newspapers in towns and counties have been disappearing for the last 15 years. The building blocks of our democracy are people in towns and communities knowing about what happens in the town hall and the county council and the local school board, and having a shared understanding of what's happening around them. But community means less and less nowadays a geographic community. And in the online world, where minorities can find their, ideological or other minorities can find their kindred spirits elsewhere in the country and in the world, we have seen a strengthening of anti-democratic, anti-social, and as we saw on January 6th, even violent communities that exist all across our country. Previously, they were in small numbers in all their communities, so they tip the balance. Now they can gather together online and agree to go to Washington and cause mayhem in a way that they could not in a pre-digital world. Now, noting that there are bad consequences to some aspects of the digital world doesn't mean that we're going to reverse it. We're going to have to be smarter about how to manage the information ecosystems around us. And so in the United States, my organization, PEN America, and many other civic groups are increasingly trying to do what we call media literacy, which is doing different kinds of coaching sessions, explaining to people how to understand which media outlet you're looking at, who owns it, what's the, who benefits from it, why are they skewing a story this way or that way. Double check it before you share it on Facebook or Twitter or other platforms. And also basic civic education. In the last 20 years, the emphasis in the United States in our elementary and secondary education has been on technology, science, and math. What we left up, that crowded out our history and our social studies and our civic education, so that we don't. I was teaching in Princeton University a couple years ago, and students who had just come out of the best high schools and were the best students and came to Princeton, I asked them what they knew about the First Amendment, the Constitution. They said we didn't get that taught. There was no classes on that in our high schools. So there's a problem in our education system. There's a problem in the disappearance of local newspapers across the country that has evaporated the kind of common knowledge of what's happening in our towns around us. And into that vacuum comes disinformation. So one of the reasons that people believe the big lies that Roger was talking about is because they haven't heard anything else. They haven't heard the true story about what happened in their world. So, and just to underscore one of the main points in my paper, we now have a political party that has been corrupted, I would say, by Donald Trump to such an extent that they are now openly campaigning to eliminate the possibility for Black Americans to vote in key states around the country, in big cities, southern states. And that is so that they can pursue other agendas. They can, as a minority party, the Republican Party has now embraced the idea that they will be a minority party of white male Christians. And as I describe in the paper, the constitutional structure of the United States gives them outsized influence in the small states around the country to control the Senate. And the Senate can block all kinds of legislation, as they've consistently done. It could repair and improve and strengthen our democracy. So this is we now have a party system that looks, at least at the formal level, like the British parliamentary system used to look, with whatever party you were in determined how you would vote, in a way that was never true in the United States necessarily in previous decades. And it's not. I mean, ours is much worse because it has this ideological and racist element to partisanship. So I don't know if that's helpful or interesting to Europeans, but I think you're going to see a lot more inward focus among American politicians, and including in our foreign policy apparatus. They will not be able to do foreign policy that doesn't make sense to ordinary Americans, because ordinary Americans feel like the government doesn't listen to them, doesn't care for them. And so that's going to affect some of the bottom lines of negotiations with Europe in coming 4 years at least. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom. I have a question to you as well, just after your presentation, because I think it was important what Roger raised in his paper, that maybe we need a sort of empathy, not towards the Republican Party or what used to be the Republican Party, as you mentioned, but maybe towards the electorate, towards the citizens. And I just listened to a presentation where I've heard that, well, maybe half of the Republican voters are Trumpists, but the other half actually is not. So whether we need a strategy somehow to seduce or convince those who are not the hardliners, which are in the United States, according to this logic, just the 1/4 of the electorate, and maybe Democrats or centrists or liberals in the States. And it's a general question. It's not only about the US. In general, what should we do? What should be done to somehow to get rid of this very pessimistic description what you made, and or maybe it's correct, this cerebral polarization, what we all have. What should we do in order to change a little bit the political landscape? Do you have any answer for that problem?
Well, I think the answer lies first in governing well. And I think you see in the Biden administration a very deliberate effort to govern, even with a very narrow majority in the legislature, to deliver what ordinary people need. They need help with their jobs, with their income, with their schools, with their towns, and to do it without demonizing the other side. I mean, the way that Biden has presented in the last couple of public speeches he's made is that he is governing for those people that you're talking about, István, that he is trying to provide economic benefits and other benefits without a sharp partisan presentation. And so part of it is governing well and delivering results to ordinary people who previously have felt disaffected from what they see as Washington elites. So that's part of it. And then the second part is this goes to what I've been saying, is that there will, I made reference to the interim national security strategy that was published a week ago by this administration. And it says in there that our foreign policy is based on our democracy and the well-being of our people. And so I think you're going to see much more of an integration of international policy and domestic policy in the language that our leaders use. Certainly, Tony Blinken is speaking in that way. And the fact that we have Susan Rice, a former UN ambassador and national security advisor, who's head of the Domestic Policy Council, the other half of the White House, not the National Security Council, shows that we're going to integrate people who previously worked in separate circles. So I think that's my answer to you, István.
Okay, very well, thank you, very well. Emil, the floor is yours. You are from our region, let's say, then we can bring together Southeastern Europe and Central Europe, as we believe in Hungary that we live in Central Europe. But you also live in Barcelona and you have international experience. So how would you actually evaluate the same problems from your perspective? The floor is yours.
Köszönöm, István. First of all, thank you very much for the given opportunity. Indeed, you mentioned earlier, I do come from a country which was called Yugoslavia once upon a time, and Hungary was our neighbor. And we always considered Hungary to be part of our own dominion. We never considered Hungary to be part of something different. Or as a good friend of mine was saying in a joke, he said like, oh, but Hungary is also in the Balkans, just it is Northern Balkans. And it is a great opportunity that I have today to talk to you, also to Roger, to Thomas, and perhaps with the audience. I hope there are going to be questions and discussions afterwards about what is it that we can do to improve the current conditions that we find ourselves as Western democracies. Because everything that was discussed until now by Roger, by Thomas, what you mentioned, and what I also write in my paper, comes from the very notion that the people are not happy. Majority of the people are not happy in the way our democracy functions and the direction where our countries are going to. And the reason for that, it is, yes, we have managed to get a lot of people out of poverty. Yes, we have managed to grow in our economies to a large degree in Eastern Central Europe, to some degree in the West of Europe and the United States. But the matter of fact is that even after this pandemic, the consequence will be that the rich will be richer, and those who were not feeling the benefits of the system will not feel the benefits of the system as in the past, or even worse. And this is something that makes people unhappy or makes people angry. And when you have angry people, of course, you're going to have people who have ambitions to harness that anger and to absorb the power for themselves by being the new messiahs. So while the institutional religion goes down, in all the countries, people suddenly have faith in new leaders, new messiahs who promise them their future based on some glorious past, or some lies that people, as Roger said earlier in his presentation, people simply want to believe in it. And I just remember one story from the Brexit. Of course, I cannot escape it. I lived in London for 12 years. I was participating in the election, in the referendum campaign, and I do have vivid experience. And in one of the stories that very much resonates to what Roger said was a lady. She opened the door, and I said that I'm from the Remain campaign. She said, "I'm sorry, I don't have the time to talk. My boy is in the living room. I need to attend to her." And I said, "Can I just ask you, how old is he?" She said, "He's 16 and I need to help him with the class." And I said, "Please, just give me 2 minutes. Can you tell me, how are you going to vote in the referendum? Please help me, because I need, to fill up my forms, and I need to report that I've spoken to as many people as possible." She said, "Oh, I will leave to leave." And I said, "Why would you do so?" She said, "Oh, because you know what? There is so many of these people from Central and Eastern Europe coming here, and they're using our NHS, our health system, and it costs so much money. We don't want that anymore." And I said, "Really? But do you really have an experience? Have you ever had a problem? Have you ever been delayed because somebody from Central or Eastern Europe jumping the queue because of you in the NHS, or you didn't get a quality of service because of that?" She said, no, but I've seen what is being said, and we don't want any more of these migrants from Central Europe. We want British people to work for British jobs." And I said, "Interesting. So can I ask you something? What is your boy doing over there? Do you want him to study? Do you want him to go to university? Do you want him to have a highly skilled, highly paid job?" She said, "Of course, my son is going to go to university. He's my only son. He'll go and finish university and have a great job." And I said, "So you don't want your son to repair our roads. You don't want your son to work in the services. And then listen, if we do not have enough British boys and girls who are going to work in the service industry to repair the roads, who is going to do that? Who is going to make it? We need to have people who are going to work over there." So, yes, that's a valid argument, but still our NHS is in danger. And I said, "My lady, may I present myself? I'm from Macedonia myself. I've been living at that time in the UK for exactly 10 years. And I swear to God, most of the time when I had a need for health treatment, I took a flight and I went to Macedonia because I knew the people, I knew the doctors, and I was being treated faster and better. I did not rely on NHS. I relied on NHS only once, when it was urgency and when I had malaria and when I was about to die. Most of the people that I know from Central and Eastern Europe usually go home to get their medical treatment during their holidays or during their visits. So I'm not really sure where do you get your figures from, but there you go, one living example in front of you, telling you that it's actually not really the case what you're saying. And she said, "Well, I'm sorry if that hurt you, but yeah, I'm still afraid of it." So what is the conclusion of this story? No matter how much arguments you present, to the people who are scared, who are afraid, who are angry, it will be very, very difficult to change their mind. There is only one way to do that, by persistent and constant work. It's not only one referendum that we are going to throw to them and then we're going to go and canvass to talk to the people directly, as I had an opportunity with that lady, but we have to do it persistently. And in particular, those people who are involved in politics, they need to connect with the electorate, understand that the system is broken, and see how and what we can do in order to change the things. Yes, I'm not going to repeat what I have written in my paper about the movements taking over, the parties adjusting in order to understand that actually the movements produce better results. I would just like to use the opportunity, based on what I have written, to comment on further on what are the prospects and opportunities forward. There is the opportunity for Europe, as Roger said, with the conference on the future of Europe. But there is also danger at the same time. If the future of a conference on the future of Europe is done by the French because French need it for the presidential elections next year, then there is going to be a big danger. If the conference of the future of Europe is not being well thought in terms how we are going to use the consultation of the citizens in different languages, then there is also a danger. Just as I mentioned in my paper, as the autocrats are able to use the narrative of democracy, the narrative of freedom, the narrative of diversity in order to impose themselves, don't think they're going to be silent and not going to use the opportunity to impose their beliefs in the narratives on the future, on the conference on the future of Europe. To the contrary, they might actually seize the opportunity to say, well, look, the Hungarians want to have Europe of nations. They don't want any more further integration. They don't want Brussels to control our rule of law. They don't want any bureaucrats in supranational to tell us what to do. This is what the Hungarian people want. So not necessarily the conference of the future of Europe is going to harness the real needs of how people want to see Europe in the future. But if we are not organized and if we do not really work super hard, we are going to have another situation as we have the parties being taken over by autocrats, democracies being taken over by leaders who are autocratic leaders and dismantling democracy, as it is the case in Hungary or in Poland. There is a big danger out there if we are not coordinated. That is why in my paper, I'm arguing that there is a massive need for coordination of the civil society movement, the one that is free, the one that is democratic, the one that is inclusive, the one that represents the people, and the democratic political parties. We need to sync our activities together. Of course, criticism is always healthy. It's easy for the civic activists to criticize the politicians, right? They don't have any responsibility, and to throw mud on the politicians and the government representatives it's an easy task to do. But also there should be a helping shoulder, which means the politicians should be much more understanding that civil society actually represents legitimate opinions of a wider majority of the public or a wider spectrum of the public. And the civil society should understand that the democratic political parties are actually an assistance and a tool for their ambitions to be fulfilled. Now, I believe, I mean, you know what, I've been in politics for way too long, and if you give me a microphone, I can fill up the entire space of hour and a half. I believe I should stop here, just throw in some additional points to what I have said in my paper to top up on what Roger and Thomas argued and what you István presented at the beginning. And I believe it will be good to have also some feedback from the participants so that we can come up with conclusions. One thing we have to understand, we are not going to be able to escape digitalization. That ain't gonna go away. That's gonna increase. And we can either be like a scared rabbit in front of a truck or scared cat, whatever, in front of the truck and saying, either we don't know what to do, or we're going to be smart and seize the opportunity to offer creative solutions. The populists, the autocrats, understand that the world is digital. They are occupying the space. That's why there is a plethora of fake organizations or fake news or fake platforms or whatever. We are not going to go back to the town halls. We are going to use our digital toys in order to communicate much more. Instead of being scared, we should seize the opportunity. The populists and the autocrats, they are not smarter. They're not more creative. On the contrary, as you said, both of you, Roger and Thomas, they're following the same manual of behavior, either by Steve Bannon roaming around the planet and saying how populists should win, or by their narrative. We are the majority. We have the freedom of thought. We have the freedom of creativity. If we team it up, we can win them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emil. That's very important what you said about the relationship between civil society and the political sphere, how they should acknowledge each other and maybe even sometimes cooperate. What I mentioned at the beginning, talking about civil romanticism, there was also a sort of anti-partisan sentiments in the civil society community, and now maybe many have learned that actually that's not the number one issue. The number one issue, who is supporting our values, liberal democracy, and who is against us, both civil actors and political democratic forces. But my question is about your story with the old lady. And maybe you might elaborate a little bit more, because I understand that your rational arguments did not help actually much, but we need something else, and you talked about it, what we need. But what about these general arguments, rhetoric, how to make it more emotional maybe, how to make it more convincing when having a debate with, let's say, not so democratically minded persons or illiberals or not so much democratic persons, but who do not belong to those very hardcore of anti-liberals and Trumpists and Orbanists and so on, whom we should actually convince. So it's a very similar question I gave to Tom, but your story gave me another opportunity to raise this question in a different form. So the floor is yours.
You know, István, I mean, we need to be honest. Even among our friends, there are people who are Trumpists, Orbanists, Erdoganists, Putinists, or whatever. Some of them would be afraid to tell us that, because they would be afraid that we're going to tell them immediately that they're horrible people, that they are racist, misogynists, homophobes, anti-democrats, whatever. Those are just scared people very often who want to be listened. Hey, we are humans. We want to be listened. We want to be able to be given opportunity to say our opinions. Let's be honest. Very often we pretend to preach people from the point of intellectual knowledge or from the point of moral superiority. That is utterly wrong. And we need to go back to the base of the people and connect with them. To be honest, I have changed myself before this event to put a shirt. I had a t-shirt before that, but I put a shirt because that will make me more smart. That is my way of thinking, because I believe this is how I'm going to convince more people if I look smart. Not my words, not what I'm going to say, but how I appear, what my background is going to be, what the lightning is going to be. We are focusing much more on things that are less relevant rather than addressing what the people want, and that is to be heard and to see that we are building a society that is more prosperous. Why are we engaged in the civil society? Why are we engaged in the political parties? We want to see change for the better. We want to see progress. We want to have more freedom. We want to have people who are going to be more happy. We are in the business of pursuit of happiness. And once people are convinced that this is what we are doing, and then on the basis of listening to them, we are coming up with solutions, then they will be much more inclined to support us. Otherwise, if they just listen us, preaching us and teaching them, they will go to the ones that are giving them easy solutions, saying, we'll go you back to the glorious past, We are going to recreate some marvelous future for you. We will give you the Avengers as the politicians or our members of government, and we are going to sort out the problems of you. We need to go back to the citizens and convince them that they are the ones who are constructing the society. They are the ones under which the society is being built. Let me just give you a quote of what a pro-Beijing politician in Hong Kong said yesterday in an interview to BBC. And I warn you, this is going to become much more repeated mantra across the world because the Communist Party of China and its system seems to be an inspiration. She said, a democratic system has no intrinsic value unless it can deliver good outcomes. That's why she says that we need epistocracy or ruled by more knowledgeable and high information people. The autocrats are going to hide behind the notion of knowledgeable and highly informed people, not the ones who are well educated, unless we go again, as I repeat, talk to the people, not only during the elections, not during the referendum only.
Okay, thank you, Emil, once again. I would like to encourage our audience to comment or raise questions. Maybe it's better if you send me or send us a message in the chat box, because I don't see face to face a lot of people here. So you cannot, if you raise your hand, I might not see it. So please send us a message. And in the meantime, I have another question to our panelists. Maybe going back to the basic, because we talked a lot, but maybe we should have discussed at the beginning whether the claim that civil society organizations, NGOs, really represent a lot of people, which is the claim of all of us who are in this sort of business, arguing that we are closer to the people more often than probably most of the politicians. But in many cases, I feel also a gap between us, whether we are, let's say, intellectually oriented or not, or arguing emotionally, or we are really grassroots, or sponsored by some donors. We are not exactly the same people very often, like ordinary ones. Do we really represent them more than political parties which are elected by them? And this is an argument what Orban and some others use against civil actors, that Orban even makes a difference between NGOs, which is an ugly word for him, and civil groups, which actually support him or which are non-political. And these are nice organizations because they don't get involved into political processes, but they really deal with everyday affairs, or maybe make some important work instead of the state very often, like so in the field of social policy and so on. But in case they are if they don't have a voice in politics, they are nice people. So my question is whether we can really claim that NGOs or civil groups do represent citizens, or that's another shift when we talk about citizens' involvement. I ask you to be very short. It's a long question, but please answer shortly. But whoever would like to start, and then we have a question already from the audience as well. Roger, please go ahead. Be short, please, all of you. Yeah,
it's a very good question, István, and thank you for asking it. Civil society organizations are generally not as representative as they think they are, and they need to work much harder at being more inclusive. And digitalization can help with that. It's inspiring what Emil said to us. But I think civil society organizations, they don't grow out of the digital sphere, they grow out of people's real experiences in their lives. It could be anything from a church group to a sports club to a political association, but they they are limited in terms of their representation, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think they should be challenged to be more inclusive and not, but not told that they don't represent anything. I think we need to remember that political parties today are not as representative, perhaps people might think. We were talking about the UK case, and the problem there is that it's a tiny majority of people in the UK who are involved in political parties. And the Conservative Party in the UK has been captured by a tiny majority of people who do go to the town hall meeting or the constituency meetings of the Conservative Party every month. And they're the ones who decide who their candidates are going to be. And so we shouldn't be surprised that you end up with MPs, Conservative MPs, who are very right-wing and very Eurosceptic because they've been selected by, there's a big problem, I think, in terms of the reality of how unrepresentative parties are at a grassroots level. I think they're much less representative than civil society organizations. Final point, and I think it touches on what Emil and Thomas were saying as well. We have to find a way to create consensus. You know, if you want to, it's too easy to do the divide and rule and look at the mess that it's made. Yeah. And, I just say this is fun. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating hearing what Emil said to us about Britain as an outsider experiencing Britain, going to Britain and living in Britain, and what Thomas has said to us about an American coming into Europe. So often we, the outsiders, understand things so well, we see things so clearly. But unfortunately, in Europe, we don't see outsiders as being able to give us something, including insights into what's going on in our lives, in our communities in Europe. We see them as a threat. And so politicians exploit that to divide and rule. We have to find ways of generating consensus. You know, that we do have more in common than divides us in society. And we have to build from the grassroots the kinds of solidarities that can actually make us focus on the things that we agree about rather than exaggerating the things that we disagree about and polarizing people for political advantage. We have to counter that. And the way to counter that is by talking to each other. The woman that Emil was talking about, you know, she was never going to be convinced by somebody not. It's a fantastic story that Emil's told us and so insightful. He was never going to win that argument. That's what he also Emil told us. But, you know, if that woman had been sitting down on a bus or with somebody else in her community, or we'd been a space in which you could have had a conversation where those ideas could have been challenged. So people start to see things from the other person's point of view, and you start to understand that, you know, it's not all one way. There's somebody else who sees it in a different way as well. This is why storytelling, conversation, grassroots work, we have to find a way to rebuild the center, to rebuild consensus. And I think that can only come from civil society and the grassroots. So, you know, where do we regenerate consensus about the fundamentals in our society and make that stronger? Because without it, well, we you know, it's too easy to exploit, and we see where that takes us.
Right. Tom, would you mind to have a short comment on that as well?
István, I'm going to defer my time to get to Katrina Steinfeld and others that may want to weigh in.
Very nice, thank you. Emil, a short comment maybe before
a very
the two
short
questions.
comment, because I mean, we also talk about transatlantic, and I would use some American words. There is a difference between a smartass and a badass, and more people like badass than smartass. Right? So as long as we in the civil society or people involved in politics, whatever, think that they're smart asses, it's not going to click with the people. The other guys are going to have more traction. So we need to understand that, and we need to learn from that. Don't necessarily become badass, but understand how the society actually works.
Okay, it's quite again a sort of pessimistic comment from you, Emil, but anyway.
No, as long as you listen, István, as long as you recognize where the problem is, as long as you understand where the issues are, you can address them. So I'm actually eternal optimist. The people who know me tell me that I'm always future oriented and positive and optimistic. The question is whether we are going to do everything in our power to work faster. and get the things fixed sooner, or we are going to allow for the situation to further decline, and then we are going to raise from the ashes?
Yeah, well, actually, what you are talking about is somehow the situation in Hungary. So I understand your point. Anyway, let's move to the audience, and there are two people who would like to make comments and maybe questions. First of all, Katrin Steinfeld, are you in Brussels? It's nice to have you with us. Okay, so the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, István, and please stop me if I ramble a little bit. I'm very excited. Thank you so much for organizing, and thank you also for the American Embassy in Budapest for co-hosting this. It really means a lot to me. And well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kat. I'm currently in Brussels. In my previous life, I used to work with a lot with civil society in Hungary. I'm half Norwegian, half Hungarian. I worked with the Norway grants, for those of you who might know this, and I do the same now in Brussels, actually. And I missed the first few minutes, so I'm gonna assume we're more or less on Chatham House rules here, that I'm not speaking in any official capacity. So just going to throw some thoughts out, and very interested in hearing your reactions to that. First of all, I just wanted to share my experience from working with civil society in Hungary back in 2014 and 2015, when you had the very famous crackdown on a number of civil society organizations that we were working very closely with. And I was so touched and excited to see Andre Goodfriend here, apropos transatlantic relations, and how extremely important the unwavering daily and very practical support was of the U.S. Embassy and Andre also personally in this very difficult time when those civil society organizations in Hungary that were not very palatable to the powers that be were really targeted, and not just for police razzias, but also for administrative harassment and a number of other very unpleasant interventions, and it was super important to us working with these organizations that the kind of dialogue and rhetoric of the American side was so supportive on the values that these civil society organizations were trying to represent, and that it's, you know, these kind of outright attacks and harassment were just not in line with the value-based cooperation that we had. So I'm super happy that we're talking about this now. And I'm very hopeful that this kind of cooperation will continue going forward as well, because it is extremely important also on the ground. So we have discussed today quite a lot of very broad questions, you know, consultations at European level, but also on the grassroots level, this kind of support and cooperation is super, super valuable and important. Then I wanted to pick up a little bit what Roger mentioned on civil society's role in bridging the gap in polarization. And actually one of my concerns is that civil society is becoming polarized. The kind of all-embracing inclusive function that civil society, we might envision civil society to have is in my view becoming more and more difficult, as the same political polarization we see in our societies trickles down into civil society space. So, you know, each side has their favorite NGOs, each side has their favorite actors. And how do we create a dialogue in this space? How can the civil society space kind of resist this trend? You also, Emil, talked about how movements are increasingly used in the political space, also because we have this massive disillusionment with politics. So you know, political messaging and political activism is moving into movements, is moving into NGOs, is moving into alternative actors, because there is a general distrust. And then I feel that this kind of, depoliticized role becomes more and more difficult. And actually what we end up seeing, and what István also mentioned, that those who are unpolitical are actually normally taking on functions more like service provision. So they're not at all, mandated, or their role is not so much to have a voice and to participate very actively in public debates, because the moment they do so, they end up in this very polarized space, and you're either with or against us. So I would love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Just one maybe important declaration that usually we have among the three speakers, at least one, but often two women. And this time we did not succeed. So it's so great that you also are with us and you made a point. So my apologies that this time we don't have women amongst the speakers. But coming back to the topic, it's again very important what you mentioned, that sometimes we have an illusion here in Hungary that those NGOs which actually just simply repeat the claims of the government may be here with us because they are also sponsored by the government. But I think you are right. They will stay with us. There is a polarization inside the civil society as well. And maybe they won't be so rich in case we will have a sort of government change or regime change, whatever word we use, but they will stay with us because this is more, they are also sometimes grassroots actually, and polarization will stay with us. Okay, let me turn to Esther, who also wanted to talk about the Hungarian situation, and it's great, Esther, to have you with us, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, István. Yes, it's a very exciting talk. And I wanted to share a background story. We just had at the end of January a video conference related to the system change in Hungary, how it happened. And Nick Thorpe, the BBC correspondent in Budapest, was also present. And he had a very, very exciting idea that the problem with the system change, because I think there are a lot of problems which are rooted at the system change period, which are still persisting by now, that the problem was then that the opposition parties thought that there is one political cake, and the transition to democracy is like sharing this political cake, not by one party, but there would be several parties eating up this political cake. And they did not understand the basics of democracy, that the political parties should also serve as, integrating or, aggregating civil, like citizens' interests, like wishes, like, to be close to citizens. And also civil society was sucked up by the parties, and civil society was basically emptied out. And even I think we are still searching our place in this field, like how to build communities, how to try to reach out to people. But to answer to Catherine's comment a little bit, I think that political statements are necessary, and we can do value-based presence. We can do value-based activities. We don't have to be political, like we don't have to do party politics as a civil society, but we can have our values, which are firm and solid. And hopefully, in Hungary, the problem is that as long as you try to follow democratic values, you are immediately placed to the opposition, because you are kind of an outrage, because you dare to criticize the government, not to criticize the government, but to stand by the values. And whenever we organize a debate, of course, Fidesz people will not come. I mean, that's quite sure, but people from the opposition. But I guess once we get, hopefully, to democracy, back to democracy, to political diversity again, like it's not going to be so, undemocratic government and democratic opposition, then hopefully civil society can find its own place again, in the Hungarian public space. Sorry, it was not so much a question, but I'm very happy to be here in such a great company, and thanks for organizing.
Yeah, well, thank you, Esther, for your comment. And I just would like to repeat what Roger mentioned, that maybe we need a sort of center when we don't have only a polarized political space and civil society, but in case we have a center, a political center, we can get rid of this idea that there are always two sides. If it's a mindset, if we accept this argument that there are two camps only, and we believe that politics is much more colorful, and maybe there are many more ideas and even more political groups, not only two, then dialogue might have maybe more chance. It's debatable, but that's my impression. Okay, now we have only 9 to 10 minutes officially, and if I am correct, there are no more questions or comments at the moment. So I would suggest to get back to our discussions, and maybe you all have 3-4 minutes to make a final statement, as usually candidates for presidencies do, or political party leaders do at the end of a debate. Whatever you want to say in 3-4 minutes, that would be nice to listen to. Maybe Emil, why don't you start this time as the first one?
Well, thank you very much again for the given opportunity. I just want to comment something on that was raised in the last 2 points, which is very important. And that's the thing of how and when we should engage with those who think different from us and who are our opponents even, or even who represent completely different values. And because not all NGOs and civil society organizations, or not even all movements which we do not like, are necessarily manipulated ones. And even though Roger is the one who said he's in Italy, I'll bring up the issue of the Movimento 5 Stelle of Beppe Grillo, which is a populist a movement, but an original one. It was not planned by an autocrat, by a dictator. It was not financed by someone, but it was rather an original movement. Many of their positions are something that we as liberals would run away from. And we would say we'd completely disagree with it, or we would actually fight in the elections against that. But there was one point when Guy Verhofstadt, then leader of the liberal group, made a deal without consulting anybody, perhaps that was a problem, to bring the Movimento 5 Stelle, their MEPs, into the liberal group in the European Parliament. Mamma mia, what a hysteria there was about any idea of talking to them. Mind you, what happened is that while the liberals were outraged, what happened is that in their style of working in their movement in 5 Stelle, they had a consultation of all their memberships. So they do their consultations all the time, and they approved actually that they should cooperate with the liberal group in the European Parliament with the view to create a common group. Strangely enough, the populists said, we'll talk and work together with these horrible liberals. But then the liberals completely ran away from the project. Guy Verhofstadt was grilled, crucified by the liberals, and the project was abandoned. Was that a missed opportunity perhaps to talk? Should there have been more different channels of discussion? Maybe not establishing a joint group, but talk to each other to see where their concerns are coming from. Why do we differentiate and diverge so much? And to see, are there any points that perhaps after a dialogue we can come to an understanding that we can offer better solutions? So I would very much advocate for an approach where we would listen to the grievances, try to understand certain things and certain proposals that we might not necessarily like, and build our responses based on that, not based on emotions and of rejections, just as they do. We should be different, and our cooperative approach should be much more human rather than socially human rather than emotionally human. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emil, once again. And now, Tom, it's your time to make a statement or any comments, if you like.
I wanted to return to the headline with which we started about civil society. And as I wrote in my little paper, the civil society in building back the United States democracy is going to be vital to this, and to enlarging the franchise so that all citizens can vote. And increasingly, people forget that the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 60s was funded in part by like the Ford Foundation and some other large charities. And a lot of American philanthropists are these days getting more and more interested in these issues of racism and political participation. So without any government influence on their donations, I think they're going to continue to play a big role in our efforts to build back better. And that's very different than the government-sponsored support for NGOs and civil society that you see in Hungary and many other countries, in the former communist world and other parts of the globe. So, there's always a government policy interest in the kind of groups that they support, and often as was reflected at the very start of this conversation, István, when you were saying that the U.S. Embassy in Budapest, which is providing a grant for your series of discussions, is not giving you any direction on how the discussion should go. That's the best kind of donor, but some governments don't always do it that way. Even the United States government doesn't always do it that way. So I think one has to be careful. And having played a role in USAID, where I oversaw a $500 million portfolio, in the 13 countries in the former communist world that we were dealing with in my bureau, I know that there's a tendency among the staff there to try to over-interpret, over-predict what the result of certain kinds of grants and donations will be, try to link them up to U.S. policy in ways that sometimes are a little tortured and counterproductive. But I'm glad that you have some unencumbered support to enable you to open up these conversations. And we in the United States, PEN America, for instance, depends entirely on, almost entirely, 95% on non-governmental private philanthropy to fund our work. So it's just a more liberating kind of experience. In the United States, that's the kind of flexibility that I think is going to be important for our efforts to repair and strengthen our democracy.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. Certainly the amount of support is not on the same scale what you mentioned, unfortunately, but we're very grateful to the US Embassy anyway. Roger, the last statement from you, please. We cannot hear you, Roger. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, István, and thank you to everyone for a wonderful conversation. I'll try to be very, very brief. I know we're only got 2 or 3 minutes left. I was in a conversation with a think tank in Brussels last week, and somebody said, I won't say which one, it's money makes the world go round. I think money used to make the world go round, probably still does to some extent, but I think citizens make the world go round. I think democracy makes the world go round too, and it's important, it matters. And lots of things happen that democracy can do things that we don't want sometimes as well, unexpected, but that's in the nature of it. I think if we haven't understood by now that citizens have found their voice in the democracy is not only fragile but matters, then we must do that quickly. And I think it's very interesting what Esther said to us about values. Values are very central. And I think back, she mentioned her event, or I think Miklos Haraszti was also speaking at that. And the spirit of 1989, I think we need to rediscover the spirit and the inspiration of 1989. I lived in Berlin in the 1980s, and I remember how it felt when the Berlin Wall came down. So I think in those values, there's also equality. Katrina's has sort of just cheekily looked her up, has had a lot to do with the equalities movement. And I think that equality is very very important value for us to remember as well, to build an inclusive society so that civil society doesn't get polarized, that every voice is heard. I think the economy is important too. I'm afraid we haven't spoken enough about that, but I just direct you to Thomas's paper, makes some really vital points about the recovery plan in the United States. I just, again, word of warning. I mean, I remember when I was a Labour MP, we spent a lot of money trying to make ourselves popular. People are grateful, but they're not so grateful that they vote for you again next time round. I think you need to have vision and leadership as well as resources. And I think that's my final point really about leadership. We need political leaders who are able to stand above the fray. I mean, I think unfortunately, I mean, it's interesting, again, the American situation where it's been such a narrow margin between the Republicans and Democrats. We had that in the UK for a long time, another place. When you as a politician are faced with a very tight political fight, the temptation is not to take any risks, is not to actually try and articulate a bolder vision for the future, a more inclusive vision for the future. I think there's a leadership role for politicians to be much braver. I think in the European Union in particular, we tend to think that people who within the Brussels bubble, people think that if you're criticizing the European Union, you're against the European Union. Being critical doesn't mean to say you're not with us. It means you're trying to be constructive. I think we need to do what István said to us before about, you know, there are those who we can talk to and those perhaps we'll never be able to talk to. And I just finished with one anecdote. When I first became a member of parliament in the UK, I overturned a huge Conservative majority as a Labour MP. And one of the first meetings I went to was in a very Conservative part of the constituency. And I said, you know, I'm proud that I've been elected as a Labour MP, but I'm here to represent everybody in the community even-handedly. And somebody stood up at the back, was a Conservative councillor, and said, I don't want to talk to you. I'll talk to you, my father, who also lived in the city. I'll talk to your father, but not to you. And this was such a gift to me. I thought this is just, you know, this was really scripted. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, you have to speak to me and I have to speak to you. You're an elected Conservative councillor and I'm an elected Labour MP for the same area. And we have to work together for the good of the community. And I got a standing ovation. And I did what István said we need to do, which is to split off those people who will never be able to reach, who are extreme and ideological and for whom identity is everything, from those who, even they disagree with me, they wouldn't have agreed, they wouldn't have voted Labour. They could work with me and appreciate that I wanted to work for them for the good of the community. And I think that's the spirit we need to come back to. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Roger. I think it was great that Esther mentioned the 1989 and the regime change in Hungary. And I know that we cannot return to that normalcy 30 years ago. So we live in different times. But in a way, I remember, and Tom might remember as well, since you were so active during those years, that civil society was actually a reference point in those years for the new parties as well, for a couple of years. And then as Esther mentioned, this reference was totally forgotten, and somehow political parties started to look at NGOs and civil groups not like their allies, but sort of competitors, and later on, much later on, as enemies, as today by the Hungarian government. So at least we should return to a period when NGOs and civil groups were part of the political process, and most of them were not satellite groups of political parties, but independent, non-partisan actors. So I think if we get to that point, at least, we will have a more healthier political society and political competition at the partisan level as well. Now, I just would like to thank you all, especially to the three authors and speakers of today, for their participation. And I think you enjoyed our debate. I hope so. And as you know, thank you. As you know, this event was also recorded, and we will place it on our website. Please share it, and please come back next time when we will have another webinar with other speakers, and we will go on with many of them still online, and maybe in a couple of months we will have a hybrid system, and then we will see how much digitalization, what Emil talked about, will go ahead, and whether we will keep this format, this hybrid method later on, or we will have traditional conferences in person on both together. But anyway, it was great to have you here with us, and see you soon in person, hopefully in a couple of weeks or maybe months this year, definitely this year, sooner or later. Thank you very much, and see you soon. It was great to have you with us. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, István. Bye.
István, megtennéd, hogy leállítod a felvételt, mert valamiért nekem nem engedi.